What does the New Testament have to say about the divinity of Jesus? Hey everyone, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the Bible, its lands, civilizations, and archaeology. I'm happy this week to be joined by Dr. James Barker, the author of Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, for a conversation about the topic of Christology. Specifically, what does the New Testament have to say about the Christology of Jesus? Dr. Barker will walk us through a variety of positions that we can see in the New Testament texts as authors attempt to grapple with this complicated question. Remember, for weekly bonus episodes, early access to ad-free video podcasts, and exclusive bonus content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/BibleandArc. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation as we dig into the Christology of Jesus in the New Testament. James, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us today about a timely conversation point here, the Christology of Jesus in the New Testament. I really appreciate your willingness to come on and discuss a very big topic here, a lot of diversity of opinion, a lot of debate. So thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
I really enjoyed your chapter on this in your recent book. And having read through that, I thought we have to talk about this coming into Easter, because I think this is just one of those topics everyone, especially if we're looking at the New Testament, everyone assumes, okay, there's a clear position here. The Bible, the New Testament, has a view on this, and we know what that is. But before we can even get to that part, can we start by backtracking a little bit and just ask you to explain this term that is going to be a part of this conversation, Christology, because this is one of those academic terms that I think sometimes everybody just kind of does the head nod of, yes, I've heard that one before. I know that one. So for you, how do you unpack that term? What does it explain or refer to?
You're absolutely right to start with the simplest question, because it can go right over people's heads, and people are not comfortable saying, I actually don't know what you mean. You know, like the Princess Bride, you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. In its simplest terms, Christology is just whatever kind of doctrine you have about Christ. But then where do you go from there? And what we are essentially talking about is that the church has always held that in some mysterious way, Jesus of Nazareth, or to call him Jesus Christ, is to say that he is somehow both human and divine. And that sounds totally normal to people who are in a church environment. They're like, yes, of course, Jesus is both human and divine. It obviously gets much more complicated when you then ask someone to explain how that works. But it's more complicated on a fundamental level because, frankly, humanity and divinity tends to be opposites.
Yeah. And
the one big difference being mortality or immortality. If I introduce you to an angel, that angel will be immortal. You can try all you want, but you can't kill an angel. So they are immortal. Well, that makes them divine beings relative to human beings. And we see this all the time in the early church when both Jews and Christians tried to talk to any Greek or Roman philosopher, and they would say, well, you believe in lots of gods then, because you have these divine beings who are immortal. And it becomes like an Abbott and Costello Who's on First routine, where Jews and Christians can't seem to explain to others how it is that somehow God is God and everything else that's a divine or immortal being is somehow not God, but clearly not human. And so that then, when you try to apply it to the person of Jesus, becomes even more complicated because, spoiler alert for Easter time, he does in fact die.
Right.
And then I always joke the other spoiler alert is he comes back to life according to the Gospels. But it's the idea that he could be divine, but he could die, but he could come back. That's where we start on this road of, well, in some way, this human was also divine, and then that's when it gets really complicated.
That, in some way, classification does feel so important for where we're going to go, because it is not uniform in position. And we're going to largely look here at the New Testament. And I think that can be surprising to someone coming into this conversation thinking, well, I have an understanding that I have taken from the text or I have heard before. But that in some way, caveat, does a lot of lifting, that there is such a multiplicity, really, just within the New Testament, of how they're trying to wrestle through, not just talking about this with people outside of the community, but inside that congregation of believers or early church or whatever it is. They're not all on the same page either.
Not even close. Yeah, we say not on the same page, and sometimes it's like they're not even reading the same book. And there's often an underlying assumption that the Bible speaks with one voice. Mm-hmm. And it's important for a lot of my students in the Bible Belt that the Bible speak with that one voice and tell that one story. And you can make it do that. But that's kind of the work of systematic theology. That's kind of the work of what your grandma's preacher told you when you went to church on Easter once a year, or as whatever you learned going to church every Sunday. And it's all been filtered so many times. And oftentimes when someone says, well, this text is basically saying the same thing as that text, there's a lot of maneuvering at play there. And I always insist that we just let each New Testament book speak for itself. Let each New Testament author, to the extent that we know who those authors were, speak for themselves. Because just if you look at Paul's letters, well, the early letters that scholars are sure Paul wrote, they don't have the same view as the later letters that scholars are pretty sure somebody other than Paul wrote. And then the Gospels are the same thing. They give you different angles, different aspects. And I'm not saying that you can't form a composite image if you want to, or if that's important to. I'm just saying before you do that, you do the hard work of saying, what does each data point say? Because it does not all say the same thing. And it's important, if you really care about what the biblical text says, to let those biblical authors speak for themselves.
Yeah, I do think that's an extremely important part of this. And I think your chapter on this does a great job for someone who might be coming to this for the first time, of trying to establish these different data points, as you say, and wrestle with divergences, disagreements. How do you want to classify that, depending on what word you're comfortable with using, maybe? But that it is a really important thing. And you use two helpful metaphors in this book in laying out the relationships, because there are relationships between these different theories. So could you walk through the two kind of frameworks you use to help us understand how these things develop and connect to each other before we get into the specifics of, okay, let's look to some of these books now and see what they're arguing?
Sure. Yeah. The two that this comes from a lot of years of teaching and trying to figure out, how do you explain this in a way that makes sense? And so the two metaphors I've come up with are the staircase and then the road. So we're going to have a staircase with multiple stairs that go up and go down, as staircases do. And then we're going to have a road that has multiple lanes, as some roads tend to do. So at the earliest, though, I think it's important to start with the staircase and go pretty low and say, what do we mean by a low Christology? Or what if we climb up to the top of the staircase and we're talking about a more high Christology? Because these are relative. And it's important to remember, at least within Orthodox and Catholic Christianity and Protestants and evangelicals, that everyone's Christology does claim that Jesus is, again, in some way, both human and divine. But we, as scholars, especially as New Testament scholars who are dealing with these disparate texts, we tend to talk about things in terms of relatively lower or relatively higher Christology. And again, saying that he's both human and divine, a relatively lower Christology will emphasize the humanity of Jesus, and a relatively higher Christology will emphasize the divinity of Jesus. Again, not denying that emphasizing the divinity somehow denies his humanity, or that emphasizing his humanity somehow denies Jesus' divinity. It's just to say, well, let's be honest with ourselves and with our intellectual capacities and limits. We can't strike a perfect balance ever. And frankly, if you look through the history of Christian theology, there are plenty of people who identify with a lower Christology, because a Jesus who struggles, a Jesus who has emotions and gets angry and is sleepy and needs a nap and is hungry and needs food, and all of that gives a lot of people a Jesus who's very relatable. And then the more divine you emphasize, somehow the less relatable Jesus becomes, and it almost defeats the whole point of the incarnation, the idea for Christians that Jesus is somehow God made flesh.
Yeah.
Well, then that becomes, if your Christology gets too high, Jesus becomes very unrelatable, because Jesus is now so divine. He's so high up in the heavens, I can't even see him. So as we plot different texts, I think it is fair to say you can put them on a staircase and say, this one's a little higher up than that one. And I find that a useful way of kind of stacking the different texts that we see. And then once we get there, we'll kind of get to the road of once we decide that Jesus has to be both human and divine. If you go all the way to your left-hand lane, and you are just as fast as you can be, and you've sort of climbed the staircase as high as you can be to emphasize the divinity, what happens is some people are saying Jesus was divine so much so that he wasn't really human. It just seemed like he was human. And that becomes, for the church, a problem to say, you actually can't believe that. That's now, you can believe whatever you want. I'm not here to tell you what to believe, but I can tell you how the early church dealt with these different texts, and denying Jesus's humanity was seen as a ditch. You have run off the road. And then the other extreme was to say Jesus was so human that he wasn't really divine. We just have a Jesus who was the son of Joseph and Mary, who was a good teacher, and we should follow those teachings. But we've already got our Jewish scriptures, and that's really all we need. Thank you very much, Jesus, for reminding us to go back and read like any good prophet would, just to read Torah. For the early church, that too, you have run off the road and you are in the ditch. You are just left with a human Jesus who doesn't have that divinity. And so now it's not really a Christology anymore, because we don't have both.
Hey, Jordan here. I want to take a moment to invite you to our first live event. That's right, we're doing our first in-person live event, Digging into Easter. Come to the James Theater here in Iowa City on April 16th for a talk with Dr. Bob Cargill about not just the biblical Easter story you know, but the history and archaeology that lies behind the tradition. With Easter coming up, we think there's no better time to gain some insight into why this relationship matters. There will be a meet and greet before the talk and a live Q&A with Bob and I after. Tickets are available now through the link down in the description. So mark your calendars for April 16th and come join us at the James Theater here in Iowa City. We're looking forward to seeing you there. But now, let's get back to the podcast. So there are limits. You can't exceed the limits of going too high or not be high enough. And that kind of places you outside the bounds of the early church's accepted positions, which I do think that's a fair point to say, this is their position. These are the historical arguments regarding some of these stances of what might be higher or lower. Because I do think when we talk about some of these things, when this comes up in class or discussing this with students, that is one of those points where in the transition to modern ideas of this, which we'll come to later, that sometimes some of the modern perspectives on this do smell of heresy, or what the early church might have called heresy at times, depending on how low in order to be that relatable version that you talked about, or how high we might be pushing things, or different frameworks might be pushing that balance point, or getting rid of the balance altogether.
Absolutely. And the balance is frankly impossible to achieve. And there was a theologian at the University of Chicago who once said, being a theologian means picking the one heresy you can live with. And I've always loved that, because it's just an admission by some of the brightest minds out there that it doesn't all add up. I always tell students it's like a game of Jenga. You move one piece and the whole thing could fall, but that all depends on where you started, and then where you built from, and how tight this was, and how near or how far this was to that. And you can imagine all of these different ways of interpreting. And that's what everybody was doing. And they had an assortment of texts that made different claims. And somehow those claims had to be assembled into dogma. And where I might be at odds with some New Testament scholars is I think that the people writing the books that became the New Testament knew that they were participating in this project. And so I think that sometimes we have to be very, very careful that we don't just go really late in the tradition and project all of that back on too simplistically to the texts themselves, as though everybody knew everything that was coming. That is the last thing that I want anyone to think that I'm arguing in my book. But I am saying, with very careful consideration and with plenty of qualifications, there are moments where you can say, this later thing they came up with in the early church to explain how all this somehow works, I think it kind of is what was there in some of these texts. But the key is that those some texts were already reinterpreting earlier texts and intentionally trying to say, when you read those, I want my book to be the lens through which you read those others. And depending on which book comes out on top, that changes how you interpret things.
Can we turn to some? We won't go through everything. We're not going to go through every New Testament book today. I'd say go to the chapter that he wrote on this that works through more of these. You talked before about Paul already, which I think for some people might be a surprise to say, let's start with Paul rather than let's start with the Gospels. So could you say a little bit for you about why you do engage with Paul in this conversation? And then some of, as you mentioned, whether we're taking everything as from Paul's hand or from a divergence of hands, some of the movements that happen there, because does Paul follow that theologian and say, I'm going to defend one heresy here, or do they move through a couple different phases of that?
No, it's a great question, and I kind of reluctantly came to Paul. I gave a presentation at a church once, and I was talking about Paul, and it was part of a series. And one person came up. The first question I got afterwards was, "Do you like Paul? Like, it sounds like you really don't like Paul." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry if I gave that impression, but I just tend to stick with Jesus and the Gospels." And the deeper I got into this project, the more all those years of teaching Intro New Testament every semester and spending a third of the course on Paul's letters, the more connections I started to see. And I thought, okay, is this like, the film A Beautiful Mind with all of the strings connected together, and this is all just imaginary and it's in my head? Or is it really this tangled? And I just kept, every time I would look over here, I would see Paul. And it's like, but I'm reading Luke. And I would look over there when I was reading John, and I was like, well, there's Paul again. And he's just this creepy guy who lurks in all the corners. And I came to believe that everybody who wrote a canonical gospel, and I always qualify an eventually canonical gospel, because there were a lot of gospels that didn't make the canon. But the ones that became canonical, I think that those four were all reading some of Paul, and actually think that that's a big question for New Testament scholars, is to sort of see the relationship. And there are folks doing excellent work on this now, of how much of Paul had such and such gospel writer read. And so we start with Paul because he wrote us our first New Testament texts, and he's he's writing them 20 years after the crucifixion, but he's also writing them about 20 years before the first gospel. Mm-hmm. So just having that background knowledge, because you have a PhD in New Testament, I started to see more and more relationships to Paul. And the lowest Christology you could see at work in Paul is at the very beginning of Paul's letter to the Romans, which is generally regarded as his masterpiece. It's the longest letter, which is why it's the first one in the Pauline corpus in the canonical New Testament. And a lot of times people say, oh, these were occasional letters. They were written ad hoc and they were written for particular congregations. And I would argue that's not always the case, because Paul says things in 1 Corinthians like, this is my rule in all the churches. And so I think he fully expected his letters to circulate more widely. But boy, when we get to Romans, that is Paul, and that is years of Paul working out his theology in a lot of argumentation and saying, this is what I believe. And I do think that it's a treatise. I mean, it starts with an addressee, I, Paul, write to you, and it ends with, and say hi to all of these folks. But everything in between is a theological treatise. And I would argue that point till sun goes down. So he opens in chapter 1 with a pretty interesting statement. If you read it literally, he says that Jesus is born of the flesh, but he is declared to be Son of God by virtue of the resurrection. And that is considered a relatively low Christology if we're trying to ask the question, at what point did the human Jesus become divine? Mm-hmm. Was he always somehow divine, or was there a moment in history when he became divine? And I'll go on to explain that I don't think that this is all that Paul has to say, the real Paul, and this is all that he thinks. But it is the lowest Christology you could have as a formulation, because it sounds like until the resurrection, right, that Jesus was not the Son of God. And I don't think that's all that Paul thought. And I'll say why, but I want to linger on that. Why would he say what he says there in Romans that sounds like that? And I think the key is that's what it took for Paul to come to believe that Jesus was the Son of God at all. Now, the book of Acts gives you this vivid description. It tells you the same story 3 times in 3 different ways. There's always a light, there's always a voice, and there's always somebody falling down. But it's Paul's conversion, as it's commonly called, which is not a very helpful term, as my students will tell you. But all Paul ever says is that God saw fit to reveal his Son to me. And so he mentions that in passing in Galatians, and you want to just stop and stick your finger in the text and say, can you please, a paragraph, please?
Say a little bit more here.
Something about it. And he doesn't. He just moves on. That God revealed his Son to me. But what we also know from Paul's letters is that he is persecuting the people that we would call the earliest Christians. The earliest people who believed that Jesus was the Son of God were claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. Paul did not believe this. Why is that? Well, Paul did, in fact, believe in such a thing as resurrection of the dead. He self-identifies as a Pharisee. Pharisees believe in resurrection. It's important to point out, with Easter, resurrection's kind of a given, right? But by the time of Jesus, the idea of resurrection of the body was really only about 200 years old as a belief within Judaism, and it is one that not all Jews believed in. The Gospels tell us as much. The week that Jesus dies, he's debating with Sadducees whether there is such a thing as resurrection or not. It doesn't come along until the Maccabean revolt. And the long story short is, God promised in Torah that if Jews kept the commandments, God would bless them, and if they broke the commandments, he would curse them. And so something like the Babylonian exile happens 600 years before Christ. And so the thinking is, well, I guess we must have done something wrong, because this sure looks like a curse to me. Never again. We shall keep the commandments, right? So the Maccabean revolt comes along because the Greeks have taken over. And this is, again, about 200 years before the ministry of Jesus. And the idea is you Jews are too different. Why are you so different? Be more Greek. Stop doing all these things that make you different. And the Jews say, over my dead body. And the Greeks say, have it your way. And we have what we come to call martyrdom, right? Mm-hmm. They die because they would rather die than break the commandments. Now we have a serious problem when it comes to the justice of God, theodicy being the big theological term for the problem of evil. If God is just, then why do all these bad things happen to all these good people, especially these pious martyrs who would rather die than keep the commandments? And so we enter into Judaism. One place in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, the only place you will find in the entire Tanakh or the Jewish scriptures any notion that there is such a thing as resurrection of the dead. That's a text that's written in light of the Maccabean revolt. And the idea is those pious martyrs will be raised back to life. They will live forever immortal and shine like the stars. And boy, will they get the last laugh, because the ones who killed them, they're going to be raised up too. But they are going to live forever in eternal conscious torment, right? So not all Jews believe this, but Paul did. But for him, resurrection and final judgment are inextricably linked. I always tell students, it's like an exam. You have that dream that you've overslept and it's final exam and then you can't find the room, right? You do not sleep through final judgment. If it happens, you're not going to miss it. Moses will be there. David will be there. The patriarchs will be there. And it will be quite a big affair when the end of history comes. And so Paul does not believe that Jesus has been raised from the dead, because he does not think you can disconnect resurrection from final judgment. And he has some sort of religious experience that leads him to believe that, okay, I was wrong, at least in part. Jesus has been raised up, and he calls him in 1 Corinthians the first fruits of the resurrection. So God has raised Jesus back to life to show us that resurrection is real, and it must mean that final judgment is coming any day now. And Paul thought he would live to see it. He thought it would happen in his lifetime. He was quite obviously wrong about that, because we're still here. He could not have imagined that the world would carry on for 2,000 years. But his belief, his change of mind that Jesus was raised from the dead, gets him thinking about what the implications of that must be. And probably his earliest formulation of that is, well, then Jesus has to be Son of God. And so then he uses the language of mystery. And I like to highlight that because, at least in my experience, Catholic students understand it better than Protestant students, because the Catholic tradition has used consistently the language of mystery to say, this is utterly incomprehensible and it's going to sound to you like nonsense, but hear me out. And so then the church explains its position. When you disregard this language of mystery, it starts to sound, very fundamentalist, like all of this is obvious. It's like 1 + 1 is 2 in base 10. And so why don't you believe it? And so I think we have to, when we're talking about something as complicated as Christology, we can't operate with that kind of simplicity. We have to acknowledge it. And so Paul starts to use this language of mystery. In the fullness of time, God revealed his son, and God sent his son. And when we get this language of sending, we then kind of say, okay, so was the son already there in some way to then be sent into the world to be born of a woman? And Philippians is then this key text, crucial text for early Christology, the so-called Christ hymn, where we have a pre-existent Christ who then is born of a woman, who lives, who dies, who is raised from the dead, and then goes back into the heavens. And then the key for that is, it's not as though by virtue of the resurrection, Jesus has attained some new status for the first time. It is that he has re-attained the status that he had before he ever entered the world in the first place. That, I argue, is a couple steps up on our staircase to a higher Christology, to have a Jesus who existed in some way, not in human form, but
Right.
in divine form. And he became human. He chose to become human and suffer this humiliating death. And he had to, the fancy word is kenosis in Greek, but it just means to pour something out. He had to pour out at least some of that divinity, or else you couldn't have killed him on the cross, right? If he were
Right.
totally a divine being, he would have been invincible. He'd still be hammering, and he'd still be saying, "I'm trying to tell you guys, you can't kill me." But it turns out he is in fact mortal, and he dies a gruesome death. But then he is raised up, and that's what Easter celebrates. And so from Romans, it sounds like, okay, maybe God just adopted him as son at his resurrection. And Philippians gives you a much fuller accounting of Jesus's complicated interplay of humanity and divinity, that he was divine. Doesn't say that he emptied all, doesn't give us a quantity, just that he had to have emptied some divinity, at least enough to become a real human and get you the both and then he lived and died, and then he was raised again. So he is in some way both human and divine, but it becomes really important to say, but it's not as though he became totally human and wasn't divine at all during his earthly ministry, because that becomes too low of a Christology. Right. You've run into the ditch, because if you're denying humanity, even for a period, then, or denying the divinity during a human lifetime, that's not going to play either. So we then get to the highest rung of Paul's letters, which I am in agreement with the consensus of scholarship that Paul didn't write. Colossians and then Hebrews, which even in the earliest church, Origen in Alexandria in the 200s famously says, only God knows who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. But both of those make a really important claim, that everything was created through the Son of God. And I always joke with students. I say, what, you didn't know that? And you should answer, no, I didn't know that, because all I did was read literally every other one of Paul's letters, none of which mention that Jesus created the very world that he was going to enter into. That seems like pertinent information. And it's only those later texts that, at least with Colossians, claims to be written by Paul. Hebrews doesn't claim to be written by Paul, but kind of it's Paul-ish. So it gets very closely associated with Paul. And they make this claim that Jesus created the world. And Hebrews is even doing some really interesting work of saying, for a time, namely during his human lifetime, he became lower than the angels. Well, why do you say that? Because angels, if you just read in Hebrew or in Greek or in Latin, if you just read what Christians call the Old Testament, what Jews call the Tanakh, angels are literally called sons of God. And so you get what I call creator Christology as a necessary corrective to say, lest you just think of Jesus as some other son of God, like all the others, who just came and showed up and acted like he was human. No, that's not what happened. He became lower than the angels because you can't kill an angel and you could kill Jesus, but that actually makes him superior because he died and he came back and no other angel ever did that. And so Hebrews is doing all of this work for you to say, not only do we believe that Jesus created all things, we specifically mean that the angels, the demons, all of those other immortal beings, they came into being through him because the Son of God was there prior to creation and was God's agent in creation. There was already a Son. And so we go from he becomes Son of God by virtue of the resurrection to, well, yes, he is Son of God by virtue of the resurrection, but he also was pre-existent because he had to be sent into the world as the Son of God to, and by the way, he created the entire universe. That's the staircase for Paul's letters. Yeah, you can climb the whole staircase with Paul, or the letters associated with Paul.
I think in that way, that's something where I think that staircase idea is so helpful in trying to, as you're laying out here, the relationships and developments, whether they're all Paul or someone pretending to be Paul and readapting these older things, that's working with developments inside the tradition. But as you noted here, with these external ideas too, that these frameworks are trying to grapple with in this way. And one that you mentioned there is the demons. Something you talked about in this chapter as well is that demons are throughout the text, right? They're constantly one of the most vocal people to affirm the divinity or an idea of sonship connected to Jesus. So is that a place where you see Paul in the corner of your eye when you're reading those types of things in something like these, or pseudo-Paul with these later texts? Or is that pseudo-Paul idea here jumping on to something like that from these gospel traditions?
That's a great chicken and egg question. But when we get to the Gospels, we starting with the so-called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are synoptic, just means you can see them side by side by side because there is so much overlap. 90% of Mark's Gospels just retold in the Gospel of Matthew, and there's just considerable overlap. John has a whole lot of unique material that's typically been separated, so we kind of have to look at how all of these are interrelated. But Mark, again, I concur with the consensus of scholarship. I think a century, the 19th century, a lot of German, a lot of British scholarship on figuring out that Mark was the first gospel. Today seems pretty obvious to us, but it took a long time for scholarship to arrive at that. What you see is no birth story, no Christmas story, right? We just have a guy, Jesus. We don't know how old he is. We know he's got a mother. We know he's got brothers. We don't know anything about his dad. But once he gets baptized by John the Baptist, and it sounds like Jesus needs forgiveness of his sins, because Mark says John was in the desert baptizing for the forgiveness of sins, and Jesus came just like everybody else. But when Jesus got baptized, he has this religious experience where a voice says to him, "You, singular, are the Son of God. You are my son." And so we get this declaration that Jesus is the Son of God. The Spirit then shoves him into the wilderness, and he spends 40 days being tempted by the devil. Again, the devil and demons being kind of tied up with this resurrection of the dead, relatively new idea within Judaism, but 200 years by the time of Jesus's ministry, to where he's at least part of that group that takes seriously that there are a lot of angels and demons at work in the world. But what happens is, now that Jesus has the Holy Spirit, he has the power over unclean spirits. And so we get a whole lot of exorcism stories. And for my students who don't grow up in church, they're surprised by this. And I say, you should be. There are just demons every time you turn around. Yeah. And Jesus casts them out. And what they say is, you are the Son of God. And Jesus always shushes them and says, don't tell people who I really am. And he's keeping his identity of Son of God a secret. And that's a really important question. And you could say, oh, Professor Barker, I know that in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus asks who people think he is, Peter says, not just you are the Christ or the Messiah, same word, just Greek or Hebrew. That's what Gospel of Mark says. Matthew adds on a line. He's reading Mark, and he adds on, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Well, yes. So Peter calls Jesus Son of God. This is when Jesus gives Simon Peter the nickname Peter. It's like calling him Rocky. He says, I don't know how you know that, because flesh and blood can't see that. that must have been revealed to you by my Father in heaven, which the exception proves the rule, that you actually shouldn't be able to know from Matthew, Mark, and Luke that Jesus is the Son of God. And then, famously, we get the centurion at the foot of the cross in the Gospel of Mark. Oh, this man surely had to be the Son of God. You can also read that as an ironic statement, right? There's a lot of debate about that. But the key point is, who most commonly knows Jesus to be the Son of God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? It's demons.
Not who you expect.
Exactly. And then in the Gospel of Luke, where you do get a Christmas story, the angel Gabriel tells Mary, your son is going to be called Son of God. He doesn't say demons are going to call your son the Son of God, which is actually what happens in the narrative. But he does know Jesus to be the Son of God. And I say, what's up with these angels and demons? This, funny enough, was the first paper that I ever wrote for A.J. Levine in fall of 2002 when I was a master's student. And I was wrestling with his idea of there being multiple sons of God in the Gospel of Luke. And I even recently found her hand-graded copy of that exam, and I texted it to her, and I said, funny enough, some of this found its way into my latest book. It only took 23 years for me to get some of these ideas out. But I for over 20 years, I had in the back of my head, what's up with the demons saying Jesus is the Son of God? So I spent a semester pondering that, and I said, well, it takes one to know one. If we know from reading Genesis, from reading Job, if we know that there are these angelic beings, angels and demons, and we know that they're part of some sort of weird angelic council that has direct access to God, when they see Jesus, they know that he's the Son of God. And we have this one famous long story. If this were a movie, it's one of the longer scenes in the gospel when Jesus sends all the demons, the legion of demons, into the herd of pigs, and then they run off the cliff and drown in the lake. They say, the demons collectively say to Jesus, have you come to torture us before the time? So they recognize his superiority to them, but they also recognize his likeness to them in the sense that you're not like all these other human beings that I can mess with, that I can possess, that I can throw into a fire, whatever. What are you doing here is in essence what they're asking Jesus. And he is revealing himself, but not as Son of God. So you can see this idea developing where the exorcisms are wrestling with this problem of there are other sons of God.
Yeah.
And so what do we do with Jesus? And Matthew, Mark, and Luke will say he is superior to them. They have to obey him. When he commands them, he's more powerful than they are.
And then that Christology becomes really important in dealing with some of those. I do think, framing them as sons of God as well in that classification. I mean, you probably have somebody's hackle standing up right now as they hear that phrase and that relationship, but that is one of these places where the wrestling, the balance of this, I think, does become important, as you've said, in trying to understand the different perspectives that the text has in coming to this, and the different difficulties that it's trying to grapple with. Because you mentioned as well the nativity here that comes in, which we don't get right in Mark. Right. How is that trying to deal with some of these questions as well? You mentioned the idea of when, at what point, when we have the resurrection. Then you've talked about the baptism moment.
The baptism for Mark, yes.
And then nativity.
So we can roll our calendar back. Like, when you rip off those pages, don't throw them away. You can roll all the way back you don't have to wait till the resurrection, right? For Jesus to be declared Son of God. You can get it already at the beginning of his ministry at the baptism. And again, this is a thing that Paul apparently knows nothing about. There's no reference to John the Baptist. Paul knows that Christians are performing baptisms, and he himself performs them sometimes, because he'll say that in 1 Corinthians. I didn't baptize many of you. I mean, there was who? Crispus and Gaius, and I can't remember who else I baptized. But apparently not many of these people in the church at Corinth. But he doesn't tell us Jesus himself was baptized, and he kind of sold the idea from John the Baptist. And then we can read the Dead Sea Scrolls and be like, well, those guys were kind of doing it every day. And all these complicated things of, where baptism comes from. The key for Christology and for the Gospels is Mark can roll the clock back and say, at least at the moment of Jesus's baptism, he was then and from then on the Son of God. What happens with Matthew and Luke is that each of them give you a nativity story where Jesus is conceived miraculously as the Son of God by the work of the Holy Spirit. So you don't even have to wait until Jesus's adulthood. And Luke's going to say Jesus was about 30 years old when he came to be baptized, right? So we don't have to wait even then. We definitely don't have to wait till the resurrection. We don't even have to wait until the baptism, because his birth was unique. He was conceived miraculously. And you can say, well, I've read Greek mythology and Roman mythology. I know there are lots of sons of God running around. Unique insofar as the God of the Jews has a son, which is, I always say to students, why don't Jews believe Jesus is the Son of God? Because God doesn't have a son. Next question. Well, why don't Jews believe that Jesus was the Messiah? Well, he didn't defeat the Romans defeated him. No further question. It's really that simple when you say that it's the God of Judaism that has this son. And Paul, again, that language of mystery is important, of saying, yeah, that was news to me too. But seeing or hearing, whatever, is believing in my case. And now you should take my word for it. So Matthew and Luke will then say Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit uniquely as the Son of God. And so that, again, if we're now putting the Gospels on our staircase, Mark is a little higher than that statement in Romans, because we could start at least as of the moment of the baptism. We don't have to wait till the resurrection. Yeah, all of the ministry was Jesus as the Son of God, and we got a whole bunch of demons who knew it. Matthew and Luke climb a couple steps higher and say, well, Jesus' entire lifetime was lived as the Son of God. It's just that after the baptism and the temptation and the arrest of John the Baptist, that's when Jesus went public. So he's private, and then he went public and started selling shares. So he ends up revealing that he is Son of God, and these demons know that he is Son of God, but it wasn't something new. Right. It was something he had been from the moment of his conception, if you're asking at what point. And then it sort of sounds like, okay, he's this supernaturally created thing, because he doesn't have a human father. He has God as his father. And so, again, not like the Greek and Roman gods and goddesses who can have kids if they want to. Well, the gods have a lot of demigods running around. If your kids read Percy Jackson like my kids do, great retellings of these sons of Perseus and son of Hades and son of Zeus, son of Apollo. That can happen a whole lot in Greek mythology, not within Judaism, right? That's out of bounds. If you only have the one God, the God doesn't have a son. And so for Christianity, yes, he does. But it was a mystery that was hidden and had to be revealed at this particular moment in history. But it does get us higher up on the Christology staircase. But boy, is John going to leap up several steps. And he ends up right with Colossians and Hebrews. And he begins his gospel, just a first sentence, that all things are created through him. And again, the joke, but it's a serious topic, but I like to say it with a smile. I mean, what, you didn't know that? No, I didn't know that, because all I had done is read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, every word of every page, none of which mentioned that Jesus had created the universe. Again, that seems like pertinent information. And John says, well, you're welcome. Now you know. He created all things. And interestingly, John's gospel has no exorcisms at all. And I think that John kind of looks at Matthew, Mark, and Luke and has a problem. Not that Jesus is the Son of God, but he has this problem with the potential confusion with the angels. So it's not angels and demons calling Jesus Son of God takes one to know one. It's a whole bunch of humans who from the get-go automatically know that Jesus is the Son of God, and he never shushes anybody. He's like, yeah, I am. Say it again. In case these people didn't hear it the first time. And why didn't you get it? And John's gospel has Jesus openly going around as the Son of God, being called Son of God. There's no problem with calling him the Son of God, but it's humans who are going to call him that, not these angels and demons.
In the divide or the distinction between the nativity version, that the rolling the calendar back there, that doesn't go to that pre-existence point, right? There's still a distinction between the nativity idea of Christology and the pre-existence that we get in John, right? They're not rolling the calendar back that far.
And that's where I think the exorcisms are important, because I kind of have this as a question mark, but it's what I've come to believe, is that I think that the exorcisms do give you this idea of, I've seen you before. What are you doing in this flesh suit? You know? And so I do think the demons recognizing Jesus as Son of God, I think it kind of puts you on this, it's not just that we're up above the Romans, well, by virtue of the resurrection. I think we do potentially have this kind of, even Mark's already on this playing field, on a nearby step to Philippians, where in some way Jesus had to have existed before, or else the demons wouldn't know. They would just run across some random human. And if the person, when we read other exorcism accounts, think like the book of Tobit in the so-called Apocrypha, the Greek Jewish scriptures, the deuterocanonical texts, you need fumigation. You can do exorcisms, but you have to know what smells they detest. And so the right fish guts can really send the right demon running. Or the Testament of Solomon is a nice text where, well, if you have a magic ring, you can control the demons. And you're thinking, I think I saw that on an old episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so there is all of this sort of mythology around how you might control a demon. But the idea that you would encounter a demon who would know that you are a son of God, and I, according to Jewish scriptures, could be called Son of God. There's an equality there that doesn't apply to all the other humans who were born naturally. So I think that there is a hint of preexistence. Not to say creator Christology, that Jesus created the universe, but the idea that, for them to recognize him, they might have known him from somewhere. Way back when.
I feel like these distinctions, they might seem small, but they are, whether you're using the staircase or you're using the road here. I do think establishing the relationships, and sometimes maybe a little bit fluid, but showing that development over time and the way they're trying to address or return to some of these concerns is so helpful in trying to see, on the one hand, some of how we might have smoothed some of these parts out, or the version that you've heard or had told to you is picking up parts from this part and picking up parts from over here to create something that addresses some of the balance or the mystery in a way that we might be more comfortable with.
And that too is why the staircase, I think, is so important, because it depends on which text comes out on top. Yeah. If the Gospel of John comes out on top and you can look down the stairs and see Matthew and Luke with their nativity story, the Gospel of John can entail those. And you can look farther down that staircase and you see Mark down there. But again, you've accounted for that. And the thing about a staircase is you don't just have to walk up it. And I am saying that I think there's a pretty neat trajectory from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John, and you can connect the dots just that simply. But I also try to qualify that the funny thing about a staircase is once you walk up the steps, you can walk back down them, because we do see later texts that do want to bring Jesus back down to earth. He was just a human who was, and so then you can put the Gospel of Mark on top. And so you can say, well, what do you do with the Gospel of John? Well, the Gospel of Philip. Christina Jacobi has this great essay on the Gospel of Philip, and says, okay, if you read in the Gospel of John that the Logos, or the Word, became flesh and dwelt among us, well, what you can do is subsume that under the Gospel of Mark and say, oh, at his baptism, the Word became flesh. So again, it matters how you stack them. Mm-hmm. And so I try to say, look, I am trying to lay this out as simply as I can. I do think when it comes to canonical Gospels, we go from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John. When we at least go early Paul, and when we go Deutero Paul, we are making a pretty simple straight line from lower to a higher Christology. But if we study church history and we read more Gospels and more texts, then we know that there are other people who are trying to plot that differently, and it does get more complicated.
As you work through this in class and you're laying out these different positions within the text, for you and your students, does it feel like they fall within one of these established versions that we get in the New Testament? Or is there kind of a new adaptation that feels very common among the students that you're laying this out with, that draws from some parts and a little bit high and a little bit low to create something different?
And in my experience, I think you almost can't go too high, and I have to warn them that you can go too high and run off the road into the ditch.
Docetism?
Right. I don't think that they know that term or would go that far, but when they get a whiff of low Christology, they recoil, the ones at least who grew up in church. And so they tend to want a higher Christology, and that creator Christology seems to be pretty deeply imprinted in their theological consciousness. Now, for students who don't grow up in church, this is all new information, and the way that we're laying it out here is a really helpful way to kind of say this is kind of how these trajectories rolled out through the centuries. But for those with a lot of background in church, then I do think there tends to be an emphasis on the high end, to where you kind of have to remind them that the humanity of Jesus is equally important. And you think to so-called liberal theologians, especially 19th century German theology, and let's just return to the simple teachings of Christ before all this Greek philosophy and dogma came along and messed everything up. I'm not trying to do that, but I think that when you say you could just look at Jesus as being adopted by God at his resurrection, and you would be one in a million in the Roman Empire who even believed that Jesus was in any way Son of God. And so the reminder that my students find most helpful is, oh yeah, okay, Christianity was not always the dominant religion. It was the tiniest of sects. And Judaism, Jews have always been a minority. You could be in the land of Israel, Palestine, whatever you say, you will offend someone. But that territory of Roman Judea, you could be in that one place in Jesus's time and not be in the minority if you were Jewish, but anywhere else in the Roman Empire. And if you just look population-wise for the inhabitants of the Roman Empire, Jews are this tiny minority. So that there was initially just a tiny minority of Jews who thought that Jesus was the Son of God. This was crazy talk to people like Paul. Like, no, he's not. Don't say that. You shouldn't say that. He didn't rise from the dead, and he's not the Son of God. Well, once Paul believed that Jesus rose from the dead, he believed that that must mean he is the Son of God. And so he had to figure all that out. And if you can try to go back and say, imagine yourself living 2,000 years ago, it's, I think, a little more helpful to say, okay, I can get how we had to start somewhere. And starting with Jesus as co-creator of the universe might not have been the most logical starting point if you were simply trying to establish the mystery that God had a son who had at long last been revealed to the world.
It is so much to try to wrap your arms around. So I really appreciate going through these. And for anyone that's interested, I would highly recommend James's book. The link will be down in the description. The chapter on this, all the chapters are great, but if you like this topic, having it spelled out for you there, I think it's very helpful. Again, I really appreciate both the staircase and the road, because I do think, as you've said, picking which one you would want to put on top and the flexibility within that and the ability to move around is so helpful in trying to re-understand or take a new perspective on this question. Because I can say for me, I think my assumption is I'm a fan of John. Like, out of the ones that just the writing of it is so, captivating. But I think my natural assumption is, oh yeah, John's at the top of the staircase. But being able to see how that can get flipped and have Mark subsume John within that is such an interesting way to just change all of how that relates.
And if you jump into the middle of the 2nd century and you look at Justin Martyr, he's just happy if you believe anything about Jesus being Son of God, because he'll lay this out, and he can write these horribly nasty anti-Jewish things. So we always have to keep that in mind. But in his dialogue with Trypho, where he's trying to convince this Jewish man Trypho that he should actually become a Christian, he'll say things like, well, we have all of these Torah observant Christians, and even some who think that Jesus was the son of Joseph and Mary. And you're thinking, oh, well, those would be called heretics, right? And Justin says, I know that there are Christians who dissociate from them, that they're not okay, but basically their Christology is not high enough and their emphasis on Torah observance is too strong. We need to make more of a break so that Christianity and Judaism are distinct. And Justin says flat out, but I disagree with those Christians. So that too is an eye-opening one. I'm currently teaching a class I teach pretty regularly called Christians, Jews, and Pagans. And so we look at these kinds of things. How did these groups define themselves? But then what happens when they start writing dialogues and talking to each other and about each other, sometimes saying nice things, but more often than not saying nasty things? It can be surprising that Justin, for all his vehement anti-Judaism, can also come along and say, hey, if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, you're good, because again, you're one in a million. I'll take as many of you as I can get, and we're not all gonna agree on everything. And it took a long time to get uniformity and dogma to have clearly established orthodoxy and heresy. And that's just going to be the nasty workings of any mass movement that grows and survives 2,000 years. And not long after Justin, you've already got Irenaeus saying, don't listen to these guys. And, these people are heretics. And the gospel of truth is, what a stupid name. It's nothing but falsehood. And so it's not as though we don't have polemics already within Christianity already in the 2nd century. It's just that you have these occasional refreshing outliers of people who say, I know we don't all believe the same thing, but it's got to be okay that we don't all believe the same thing, because none of this adds up perfectly. But like you, John comes out on top. That's how I see it. I think that's how my students see it. It's absolutely how church tradition saw it. And but it didn't have to be that way. Mm-hmm. It could have been otherwise, and that's always a useful thought experiment for students.
Well, Dr. Barker, I think that's a wonderful place to land. Thank you so much for walking us through this. It's a lot I appreciate it. I think this is a wonderful explanation, very timely with Easter coming up. If there are questions you have, again, I highly recommend going and reading the book. But thank you for your time today. It was a joy.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the work you all are doing.
Thank you. Thank you for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology. Like and subscribe wherever you find us. We're happy to have you along. If you have a question we didn't get to, write it down and maybe we can reach out to talk again in the future. But for today, that's all we have. Until next time.